Chapter 11 also includes our discussion on radio. This is our second element of the promotional tool of advertising. Right? So we're still in our advertising category here, and another medium to advertise to our consumers is through radio. So over time, with the growth of television, radio has actually evolved into more of a local advertising medium, where we find that advertisers use television to target the United States as a whole, or really focus on that mass audience. But radio today really is more local and regional. It can be highly specialized, and so it's very appealing to narrow segments of the population. Specific stations are located in specific geographic areas, and so we can select who our audience is based on that information. So there are actually around 11,300 radio stations still in existence in the United States today, and that number is down from what it was 5 years ago because people are moving to online radio stations such as Spotify, Pandora, and even satellite radio. But 11,000 is still a really big number. What's actually surprising is that the average American is still listening to about 2 hours of radio per day. And on the weekend, that's even higher. It's usually closer to 3 hours per day. And that does include internet radio, which if you start to think about it makes sense because what's the average commute time? The average commute time is 45 minutes to an hour in the United States. So when you think about listening to the radio in your vehicle or even listening to the radio during your workout, that 2 hours adds up pretty quickly. So it's still a really effective medium to reach a lot of people at a given time. So just like we did for television, we're going to talk about the advantages and limitations of radio. And what you're going to see is that a lot of these advantages and limitations are incredibly similar to the ones we looked at for TV. And that's because they both fall into that same advertising category of promotional tools. Right? So a lot of these are going to ring a bell from last Tuesday. But one of the big advantages of radio is that it is cost effective and it's very efficient for the advertiser. Radio spots are very inexpensive to produce. A script is all you need, and that script is written by the advertising manager and then read by an announcement, or sometimes it's pre-recorded in the studio and then replayed. But the cost per thousand is only around $3 to $4 for a radio commercial. And when you think about that compared to TV, we saw that TV varied around $44 for the cost per thousand. So this is much more cost effective to reach an audience. And that low cost allows advertisers to have a much larger reach, and it allows advertisers to increase their frequency. So they can run a lot more radio commercials compared to the couple of TV commercials for the same price. Another good thing in terms of efficiency of radio ad is that it can be produced and sent out much quicker than a TV commercial. So we talked about the average production time for a TV commercial being 5 to 6 months. Right? For TV or for radio commercials, that could be just a couple of days, depending on how long it takes to write the script. So it's a pretty quick form of media. Receptivity is another advantage. So studies show that radio listeners are emotionally connected to the programming that they're listening to. So they're invested in the music. And if you think about that, music really does improve your mood. It comforts you, it motivates you. You listen to the songs, you listen to the lyrics, and you really kind of have a connection to that music. And therefore, studies show that that connection extends out to the advertising that you hear in between those radio songs. Okay. We already talked about selectivity a little bit. I mentioned that at the beginning of this lecture, but you can easily specify specific geographies, even through online radio with the use of zip code search. You can be very selective with where you are focusing your radio ad, and that's why it's such an effective advertising medium for local advertisers, because they don't have to go outside of their geographies. As we talked about, TV channels tend to reach wide areas of a geographic region. Radios are much more narrow. Radio stations are much more narrow. In terms of flexibility, radio is the most flexible of any advertising medium in this advertising category. And the reason being is that you can change the copy up until a minute before it's played. So if you have a big change, you can call the radio station and sub out a script for the script that they're about to read. Right? All it is a matter of rewriting the script and making sure it's sent to the radio station before they read your ad. So incredibly flexible. All right, so cost and efficiency, receptivity, selectivity, and flexibility are the 4 big advantages. And let's talk about a couple of limitations. Right? First of all, creative limitations. Exact opposite of TV. TV is the most creative of any promotional tool. Right? Radio severely limits your creative abilities, though. And the major drawback is that you have this absence of a visual image. Right? So you have to really use the words and the music to connect with your consumers. You don't have that visual connection there. Fragmentation. So let's talk about what fragmentation is. Right? Fragmentation means that the percentage of the market that's actually tuned in is very small. So top-rated radio stations attract less than 10% of the total listening audience. Think about the number of radio stations you can tune into in a city like Atlanta. Over 50 radio stations exist in the Atlanta market. So when you think about that, as people are driving and they're tuning into those 50, that audience that you're reaching is spread out amongst those 50 stations. So it is very fragmented. Now here in Milledgeville, fragmentation isn't a problem, right? We have like one radio station we can get. Right? But in larger cities, there is an issue of fragmentation and having smaller listening audiences per station. We might also have some limited listener attention, and this contradicts a little bit about what we talked about with receptivity being an advantage and how listeners are emotionally connected, but there is also an issue of this limited listener attention. So radio programming becomes a background for other activities. So if you think about you're listening to the radio while you're working out, or you're listening to the radio while you're studying or while you're driving. It's never the first thing you're doing. And if you compare that to TV, when you sit down to watch TV, usually what you're doing is watching the television. Right? We don't sit down and stare at our radios and listen to the words. Right? We're always doing something else in the meantime. So because it becomes background noise, if the listener gets distracted, they're going to miss your commercial. And then the last thing we need to mention is the competition from digital media. Right? So this would be your satellite radio, and this would be your internet radio where you pay for a subscription to avoid the commercials. Right? Online digital media, and music stations tend to be commercial free. Even on Pandora and Spotify free radio, there's only about 6 minutes of commercials per hour. So when you think back to what we talked about with TV, there's about 18 minutes of commercials an hour, right? So there are a lot fewer commercials per hour on the radio. And then, right, you have the option to pay to completely avoid all of those commercials. So that competition from digital media and the fact that digital radio is so inexpensive, advertisers are struggling to be able to reach the amount of people that they want to reach. All right, so 4 big advantages, 4 big limitations. We can see how those are similar to what we talked about with TV, and we can also compare those to TV. Right, the next topic in radio that we're going to discuss is how we actually buy radio time. And again, you're going to find that this is incredibly similar to what we talked about with TV. You can buy radio over the network, just like you would with television. So there are 7 national radio stations in the United States. And so if you are a national advertiser and you want to advertise on network radio, you will contact one of these 7 national stations, and you'll be able to buy space for all of their affiliates across the country. And just like with television, right, this lowers the cost per advertisement. So national advertisers get a little bit of a break in terms of what they're paying when they advertise on network radio. Okay. There's also what we call spot radio, very similar to spot TV. This is the opportunity to adjust to local market conditions. Right? Nearly 80% of radio ad time is bought by local companies. Okay? So only 20% of radio advertising is bought by national companies. So this truly is a local medium. We're using it to reach a local audience at the individual station level. Okay? So just like television, Sometimes national advertisers will use spot radio in order to get flexibility in selecting their markets and adjusting to local market programming that they may have, such as promotional sales, or if they need to combat competitive forces in that market. Okay, so they're still using spot radio, but it is mostly used by local radio. And the biggest types of industries that use radio advertising are auto dealers, restaurants, and financial institutions. So you've got your banks, your restaurants, and your automobile dealers who are using radio the most in terms of talking to their customers. Right. Now, we talked about with TV how a lot of advertisers, especially during prime time, want to purchase for a specific show, right? But remember how the rest of the time was bought in day parts? Same thing with radio. So all radio advertising is bought in terms of day parts. So as an advertiser, as one of those banks or restaurants or automobile dealers, when you call to purchase your space, you're going to buy it during either morning drive time, daytime, nighttime, or the overnight hours, or the afternoon, evening drive time, right? So there's 5 big day parts that you can buy radio ads for. So as an advertiser, you don't know specifically when your ad is going to run. You just know it's going to run during one of these day parts. Now, there are a few exceptions. So you can buy the space directly around the weather report. You can buy the space directly around the traffic report, and those tend to be much more expensive. Right? And think about that. The reason being is that people tend to turn their radio up, and so they'll listen to those spots, and so they're more likely to hear your commercial. But otherwise, it's all bought at the general day part schedule. Okay. All right, so for radio, that's all we're really going to discuss. There are formulas that we use to measure the radio audience, but that data tends to be behind a lot of locked doors, so we're not going to look into the specific measurements there. But do know that you can measure the radio audience during these specific day parts to see who's listening when to that live radio. But in terms of the actual calculations, we're not gonna hit those. All right, so don't forget that you do need to go onto Georgia View and take your quiz on radio.